Where did Mary Shelley get the inspiration for Frankenstein? Originally published as Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus on January 1st, 1818, Shelley started writing the story when she was 18, and the first edition was published anonymously when she was 20. Her name first appeared in the second edition in 1821. Mary Shelley was born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin on August 30th, 1797 in London, England, to parents William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. Shelley's mother died from infection 11 days after giving birth to her. Having never known her mother, Shelley grew close to her father. However, his second wife, Mary Jane Clairmont, did not like their close bond. The resulting friction caused Shelley's father to favor his other children. Fortunately, Shelley's father was a famous author in his time, so her education was very important to him, even though it was not formal. Shelley grew up surrounded by her father's friends, writers, and persons of political importance, who often gathered at the family house. This inspired her authorship at an early age. Mary, at the age of 16, met Percy Bysshe Shelley, who later became her husband, while he was visiting her father. Godwin, Shelley's father, did not approve of the relationship between his daughter and an older married man, so they fled to France along with her stepsister, Claire Clairmont. On February 22, 1815, Shelley gave birth prematurely to her first child, Clara, who died 2 weeks later. Shelley traveled through Europe in 1815, moving along the River Rhine in Germany, and stopped in Gernsheim, 11 miles away from the real-life Frankenstein castle. About a century earlier, Johann Conrad Dippel, an alchemist, had engaged in experiments here that, along with galvanism, would completely change the world of literature and give us the genres of horror and science fiction. Dippel was born at Castle Frankenstein in 1673 and is the probable prototype for Dr. Frankenstein in Shelley's novel. Although it has never been confirmed, it is thought by some historians, not all, that there might have been rumors that Dippel experimented on cadavers in an attempt to create life. If Shelley had heard these stories, then Dippel's connection to the Doctor is a pretty solid theory. Galvanism is the idea that animal electricity remains in tissue after death, and that electrical currents and lead can stimulate this electricity to reanimate the dead. The concept of galvanism was inspired by the experiments of Luigi Galvani, an anatomist who observed that a frog's leg muscle twitched when his scissors touched a nerve. In the summer of 1816, Mary, Percy, and her stepsister Claire took a trip to Lake Geneva in Switzerland's Alps to visit Lord Byron, Claire's lover, and John William Polidori, Byron's personal physician. Poor weather conditions, more akin to winter, forced the party to stay indoors. This period was known as the Year Without a Summer. In 1815, the eruption of Mount Tambora caused the world to be locked in a long, cold volcanic winter. The weather was too cold and dreary that summer to enjoy the outdoor holiday activities Shelley and company had planned, so they stayed indoors. Galvanism and occult ideas were topics of conversation for the group, particularly for her lover and future husband, Percy Shelley. Sitting around a log fire at Byron's villa, the group passed the time by reading German ghost stories translated into French. Byron proposed that they each write a ghost story. Unable to think of a story, Mary Shelley became anxious. She recalled being asked, "Have you thought of a story?" each morning, and every time being forced to reply with a mortifying negative. During one evening in the middle of summer, the discussions turned to the nature of the principle of life. Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated, Mary noted. Galvanism had given token of such things. It was after midnight before they retired, and, unable to sleep, she became possessed by her imagination as she beheld the grim terrors of her waking dream. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. This was Shelley's inspiration for Frankenstein. How brilliant that she was able to come up with the idea of a scientist who created life who was horrified by what he had made. She was just 18 years old when she won the contest with her creation of Frankenstein. Frankenstein is one of the most well-known works of English literature, infused with elements of the Gothic novel and the Romantic movement. It has had a considerable influence on literature and on popular culture, spawning a complete genre of horror stories, films, and plays. Since the publication of the novel, the name Frankenstein has often been used incorrectly to refer to the monster rather than to his creator father, Dr. Frankenstein. Mary Shelley began writing what she assumed would be a short story, but with Percy Shelley's encouragement, she expanded the tale into a fully fledged novel. She later described that summer in Switzerland as the moment when I first stepped out from childhood into life. Shelley wrote the first 4 chapters in the weeks following the suicide of her half-sister Fanny. This was one of the many personal tragedies that impacted Shelley's work. Shelley's first child died in infancy, and when she began composing Frankenstein in 1816, she was probably nursing her second child, who was also dead by the time of Frankenstein's publication. Shelley wrote most of the book while residing in a lodging house in the center of Bath, England in 1816. Byron wrote a small piece based on the vampire legends he heard while traveling the Balkans, and from that fragment, John Polidori wrote The Vampire, which was a short story published in 1819 and is the progenitor of the romantic vampire literary genre. Thus, 2 seminal horror tales originated from the ruins of a volcanic eruption. Growing up, I and everyone else knew of Frankenstein. Doubtful many of the people I grew up with read the book or even saw the original movies, which is a travesty because of how great a piece of literature the original novel was and still is. My introduction, along with those I knew, would have come from the likes of Scooby-Doo, Halloween decorations, SNL, Young Frankenstein, and other pop culture references. When you say Frankenstein, everyone knows what it is and what you mean. Even my 3-year-old son knows who Frankenstein is. It's extraordinary and undeniable how much this monster and his creator have had on our life. Fun facts. Frankenstein's monster in the book is very swift and fast as well as intelligent. He's not clumsy and slow like what they show in the movies. He easily made friends with someone that was blind, showing that he is capable of being friends with people if it wasn't for his horrifying looks. The reason the movie is so different from the book is because the 1931 movie is based on the 1920s play by Peggy Webling, as opposed to Shelley's book. Universal bought the rights to the play and not to Shelley's book, presumably because it was recognizable to the people of the day, would be a selling point to audiences, and the book is more interior, which would be harder to film. The modern Prometheus is the novel's subtitle, even though it has been dropped in modern editions. In Greek mythology, Prometheus was the titan who created humans in the image of the gods. Shelley's original manuscripts are now housed in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. In September 2011, astronomer Donald Olson visited Lake Geneva to find the date and time that Mary Shelley had her waking dream. Olson inspected data about the motion of the moon and stars and concluded that the dream took place between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on June 16, 1816, several days after Lord Byron suggested that they each write a ghost story. In 1803, a real-life experiment was performed in London that involved applying electricity to the dead body of a criminal. The corpse moved and its eyes snapped open. Have you ever had a writing competition with your friends or loved ones? Would you like to? Did any good writing or stories come of it? Let me know in the comments. What do werewolves, bats, blood, Ireland, Saruman, Oscar Wilde, Robert Pattinson, Transylvania, and Frankenstein all have in common? The 1897 Gothic horror novel, Dracula. Written by Irish author Bram Stoker. He was born on November 8, 1847 in Dublin, Ireland, and died on April 20, 1912 in London, England at the age of 64, according to his death certificate due to locomotor ataxia. But where did Bram Stoker get his inspiration for this beloved horror icon? Many believe his main inspiration comes from Vlad the Impaler, for many reasons, but primarily because one of Vlad's names was Dracula. Vlad had this name because his father, Vlad II, was given the surname Dracul, which means dragon in Romanian, after joining the Order of the Dragon. Dracula is the Slavonic genitive form of Dracul, meaning the son of Dracul or the dragon. So it really has nothing to do with vampires or the undead. Stoker actually believed Dracula just meant devil in Romanian. David J. Skal, who wrote the book Something in the Blood, The Untold Story of Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula, stated in the book, the name Dracula was not well known outside of Romania, but Stoker would make it world famous as the historical source and embodiment of the vampire mythos. In reality, Vlad's connection to Stoker's character was more fortuitous than inspirational, and the author's research was surprisingly thin, but over time, and especially with the release of Francis Ford Coppola's misleadingly titled 1992 film Bram Stoker's Dracula, Vlad's story is now universally misunderstood as Stoker's central source of impetus, and the novel itself is an overheated romance about Dracula's quest over the centuries for the reincarnation of his long-lost love. The motif appears nowhere in Stoker's book or his foundational notes. So, like a lot of modern-day writers, myself included, he just went with what sounded like a cool name. But what about Countess Elizabeth Bathory? Some believe she, not Vlad, was the real inspiration for Stoker's bloodthirsty count. Why is that? Well, Bathory, born August 7th, 1560, was a Hungarian noblewoman and alleged serial killer. She and 4 of her servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of girls and women from 1590 to 1610. She and her servants were put on trial and convicted. The servants were executed, whereas Bathory was imprisoned within a castle until her death in 1614. The charges leveled against Bathory have been described by several historians as a witch hunt. Others have said that the accusations against Bathory were supported by testimony from more than 300 individuals, some of whom described physical evidence and the presence of mutilated, dead, dying, and imprisoned girls found at the time of her arrest. Recent sources claim that the accusations were a spectacle to destroy her family's influence in the region, which was considered a threat to the political interests of her neighbors, including the Habsburg Empire. Stories about Bathory quickly became part of national folklore. Legends describing her vampiric tendencies, such as the tale that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth, were based on rumors and only recorded as supposedly factual over a century after her death. Although these stories were repeated by at least 3 historians in the 18th and 19th centuries, they are considered unreliable by modern historians. Although Vlad the Impaler and Countess Elizabeth Bathory seem like the most likely of candidates in inspiring Count Dracula, neither figure is ever mentioned in Stoker's plethora of notes. So, if it was neither of these historical figures, then what was it? Well, Stoker worked on the novel for about 7 years, producing over 100 pages of notes for it, drawing extensively from Transylvanian folklore and history. Stoker was a member of the London Library, and they have 25 of the actual books he used as reference material. Many have notes in the margin in his handwriting, plus dog-eared pages for finding relevant passages. And one of his main sources was a book on Transylvania called The Land Beyond the Forest by Scottish writer Emily Gerard. Gerard's The Land Beyond the Forest is credited with introducing Stoker to the concept of Nosferatu, a vampire-like creature who sucks the blood of innocent victims. She wrote the book after spending 2 years in the mid-1880s in Romania with her husband, who was posted there as an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army. The Land Beyond the Forest was one book that Stoker actually owned rather than having to borrow from the library. Bram Stoker's son actually gifted his father's copy of Gerard's book to the London Library in 1935. In the book, Gerard wrote, "More decidedly evil is the Nosferatu, or vampire, in which every Romanian peasant believes as firmly as he does in heaven or hell. Every person killed by a Nosferatu becomes likewise a vampire after death, and will continue to suck the blood of other innocent persons till the spirit has been exorcised by opening the grave of the suspected person, and either driving a stake through the corpse, or in very obstinate cases of vampirism, it is recommended to cut off the head and replace it in the coffin with the mouth filled with garlic." Another book Stoker used allowed him to adapt the basics of vampirism. In this book, Stoker found actual methods of vampire disposal that were used on suspected corpses: a sharp stake through the heart, decapitation, and cremation. Other methods included the removal of the heart rather than its staking. These were all physical measures taken against a physical threat. For the most part, Stoker intended his vampires to be reanimated corpses, not, as some traditions held, an astral projection of the vampire, which in its nocturnal wanderings collected blood that was somehow dematerialized and physically reconstituted in the grave-bound corpse. The 1888 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica presented this view, but Stoker went his own way. He had the vampires keep the power of dematerialization, but didn't worry about them transporting the blood. He gave Dracula the ability to shapeshift into a bat, a trait not found in folktales, but the additional ability to assume the form of a wolf, something he found in Sabine Baring-Gould's The Book of Werewolves. Baring-Gould described the Serbian Vlaxlac, a vampire-werewolf hybrid, and related the Greek belief that werewolves become vampires after death. Stoker liked the descriptions of werewolves so much that he incorporated them almost verbatim into his description of Dracula. Baring-Gould, for instance, says the werewolf's hands are broad and his fingers short, and there are always some hairs in the hollow of his hand. Dracula's hands are rather coarse, broad with squat fingers. Strange to say, there were hairs in the center of the palm. Baring Gould also gave Stoker descriptions of werewolf eyebrows meeting above the nose and sharp white teeth protruding over the lips. Sound familiar? Since so many film adaptations of Dracula have sunlight as his weakness, incinerating and killing him, readers of Stoker's novel are often surprised that the Count walks the streets of London by day unscathed, although his powers are diminished in the light. In folklore, the vampire, like other evil spirits, retreats into hiding by day but is never destroyed by the sun. Stoker once told an interviewer that he had always been interested in the vampire legend because it touches both on mystery and fact. He went on to explain poorly understood natural phenomena. A person may have fallen into a death-like trance and been buried before the time. Afterwards, the body may have been dug up and found alive, and from this a horror seized upon the people, and in their ignorance they imagined that a vampire was about. Those prone to hysteria through excessive fear might themselves fall into trances in the same way, and so the story grew that one vampire might enslave many others and make them like himself. Okay, so now that we know where his monster came from, what about the setting? Like the Count, his castle and the surrounding area was an amalgamation of multiple places, the main one being a ruined castle in Cruden Bay, Scotland. Stoker went to Cruden Bay in Scotland often between 1892 and 1910. His month-long visits to the Aberdeenshire coastal village allowed him to write a lot. Two of his novels were set in Cruden Bay: The Water's Mow, published in 1895, and The Mystery of the Sea, published in 1902. Stoker started writing Dracula there in 1895 while staying at a hotel. The guest book with his signatures from 1894 and 1895 still survives. The nearby Slains Castle is linked with Bram Stoker, and it is thought to have greatly influenced the descriptions of Castle Dracula. A distinctive room in Slains Castle, the Octagonal Hall, matches the description of the Octagonal Room in Castle Dracula. Stoker also visited the English coastal town of Whitby in 1890, where he stayed at a guest house in Westcliff at 6 Royal Crescent. He did research at the public library at 7 Pier Road, now Quayside Fish and Chips. In the novel, Count Dracula comes ashore at Whitby and, in the shape of a black dog, runs up the 199 steps to the graveyard of St. Mary's Church in the shadow of the Whitby Abbey ruins. And this is only a small sampling of research Stoker did for the novel. He spent 7 years writing hundreds of pages of notes to get the authenticity and story just right. If you want to know more about him and his research, pick up the biography already mentioned, Something in the Blood, The Untold Story of Bram Stoker, The Man Who Wrote Dracula, by David J. Scal. If you're wondering at the beginning why I connected Dracula to werewolves, bats, blood, Ireland, Saruman, Oscar Wilde, Robert Pattinson, Transylvania, and Frankenstein, allow me to explain. I believe I already covered the connection to werewolves, bats, blood, Ireland, and Transylvania, but the others can be explained just as quickly. Saruman, from The Lord of the Rings, was played by Christopher Lee, who also played Dracula in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Robert Pattinson played a vampire in Twilight. Oscar Wilde was in love with the woman who became Bram Stoker's wife. And Frankenstein has often been linked to Dracula through the Universal Studios monster movies and other interpretations. Dracula is one of the most famous pieces of English literature. Many of the book's characters have entered popular culture as archetypal versions of their characters. For example, Count Dracula as a quintessential vampire, and Van Helsing as an iconic vampire hunter. The novel, which is in the public domain, has been adapted for film over 30 times, and its characters have made numerous appearances in virtually all media. How were you introduced to Dracula? Stoker's novel? Movies? TV? Halloween costumes or decorations? Count Chocula? Let me know in the comments. The werewolf is a mythological animal and the subject of many nightmarish stories throughout the world. According to legend, werewolves are people who transform into monstrously powerful and vicious wolves. Others are a mutant combination of human and wolf. All are bloodthirsty beasts who cannot control their lust for murder. I have a question for you. How did we go from the bone-chilling description I just read to this man with fur on his face? An oddly popular monster who I, even as a child, found to be more on the comedic side than the actual scary side. To me, this one has always been a, oh man, you can totally see the zipper on the monster type of situation. I'm sure many disagree with me, but today we will find out how the horrifying legend of the werewolf became the Wolfman. And a little disclaimer, I'm making this video right before the new Wolfman is supposed to come out in 2025, so maybe my opinion of him will change and I'll be a total convert. I hope so. I love the concept of the werewolf. Most are just too cartoony like Michael J. Fox and Teen Wolf, which makes sense in a comedy. Or the practical effects in the movie are just not great. And the rest just use way too much CGI. Although I do enjoy the werewolves and all the effects of the Underworld movies. They did a great job of mixing the two. I'm interested to see if the new Wolfman does something similar. Unlike his brethren, Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, who both come from amazingly written novels, the Wolfman does not have one particular source that we can point to for his origin. His beginning is shrouded in as much mystery as the full moon that summons him. Stay tuned as we dive into his history and what the newest interpretation has to offer in this full moon edition of Story Behind the Story. The Wolfman's genesis starts with the myths of long ago. We can then trace their path to where they culminate with the bastardization of its current form, which is typical of modern-day Hollywood. Why do I say that? Well, in traditional mythology, a werewolf was a human that has the ability to transform into a large wolf, whether that be at midnight, usually involuntarily and during a full moon, or on command. Weirdly enough, Twilight of all things went in the direction of traditional mythology when it comes to werewolves, although in their original forms vampires are affected by sunlight similar to what the Twilight franchise shows. In the mythology he based Dracula on, sunlight doesn't actually kill a vampire, so in a way, Stephenie Meyer's interpretation was actually pretty traditional, except for the sparkly part, that is. Watch until the end of this video if you want to find out more about Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. But now, we'll go into detail about the mythological origins of the werewolf. History.com gives a lot of good information on the history of werewolves. That link, as well as a more in-depth one about werewolf trials in Europe, similar to the Salem witch trials, are in the description. Tales of werewolves go back thousands of years. Some scholars believe werewolves were first mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh jilted a potential lover because she turned her previous mate into a wolf. In Greek mythology, Lycaon, the son of Pelasgus, angered Zeus when he served him a meal made from the remains of a sacrificed boy. As punishment, the enraged Zeus turned Lycaon and his sons into wolves. In early Nordic folklore, wolf pelts had the power to turn people into wolves for a number of days. The saga of the Volsungs tells the story of a father and son who discovered wolf pelts that had the power to turn people into wolves for 10 days. The father-son duo donned the pelts, transformed into wolves, and went on a killing rampage in the forest. Their rampage ended when the father attacked his son, causing a lethal wound. The son only survived because a kind raven gave the father a leaf with healing powers. Many people who were accused of being werewolves centuries ago were just serial killers. France, weirdly enough, had several. In 1521, Pierre Burgot and Michael Verdun allegedly swore allegiance to the devil and claimed to have an ointment that turned them both into wolves. After confessing to brutally murdering several children, they were both burned to death at the stake. Burning was thought to be one of the few ways to kill a werewolf. Gilles Garnier, known as the Werewolf of Dole, was another 16th century Frenchman who claimed an ointment morphed him into a werewolf. As a wolf, he viciously killed children and ate them. He too was burned to death at the stake for his monstrous crimes. Peter Stube, a wealthy 16th century farmer in Bedburg, Germany, is considered by many to be the most notorious werewolf of them all. According to folklore, he turned into a wolf-like creature at night and devoured many citizens of Bedburg. Peter was eventually blamed for the gruesome killings after being cornered by hunters who claimed they saw him shapeshift from wolf to human form. He experienced a grisly execution after confessing under torture to savagely killing animals, men, women, and children, and eating their remains. He also declared he owned an enchanted belt that gave him the power to transform into a wolf at will. Not surprisingly, the belt was never found. Instead of actually being werewolves, it's way more plausible that these men, and others like them, were either mentally ill, hallucinating because of a foreign substance, or simply just psychopathic killers, or, as was probably the case for Peter Stube, they were framed because of a, no pun intended here, political witch hunt. Regardless of why, it didn't seem to matter to superstitious Europeans during the 16th century. To them, such heinous crimes could only be committed by the horrific beast known as the werewolf. Some legends maintain that werewolves shapeshift at will due to a curse. Others state that they transformed with the help of an enchanted sash or a cloak made of wolf pelt. Still, others claim people become infected after being scratched or bitten by an already existing werewolf. No matter the reason, every instance has always iterated how evil and destructive the werewolf is. So even though there is a plethora of mythology and information on the legend of the werewolf, if there's no book or specific origin for him, then what is the original Wolfman based on? This is from a Google search I did. While Dracula and Frankenstein were based on literary sources, there is no defining novel on which to base the Wolfman. As such, many details we associate with the werewolf legend, including the business with the full moon and the silver bullets, were invented by screenwriter Curt Siodmak.
Interesting. Let's see how accurate that is. When I looked up the screenwriter Curt Siodmak, I immediately saw a few things about him that piqued my interest.
The first is that he lived to be almost 100 years old. 1902 to 2000 is a long and crazy time to have lived. The second being, he was born in Dresden, Germany in 1902, and he was Jewish. Read Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut if you don't know what happened to Dresden at the end of World War II. I'll give you a hint. If the Allies had lost the war and/or we never used nuclear weapons on Japan, the bombing of Dresden would be talked about similar to how we talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki today. It was that bad. But no one talks about it because we nuked Japan and won the war. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but that's the gist of it. Before World War II, though, Curt Siodmak had success as a novelist and in German films. That is, until he heard an anti-Semitic tirade by the Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. He then decided to immigrate to England, where he made a living as a screenwriter before moving to the United States in 1937. His big break in Hollywood came in 1941 with the screenplay for, what else but, The Wolfman. This movie is what started it all. It established the Wolfman as the most popular movie monster after Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. What better company to be in? As I said earlier, in the film, Siodmak created several werewolf legends. The main ones being that werewolves are practically immortal, they can only be killed by being shot by silver bullets, and that their transformations happen during the full moon. On a side note, another fact about Curt Siodmak that I found interesting was that he's the one who wrote the novel Donovan's Brain, which has been adapted into a movie on 2 separate occasions. If you're a horror fan, and you're like me, then you haven't seen that movie or read the book, but you read Stephen King's book on horror called Danse Macabre, where he discusses the novel and its subsequent movies at length. To create the Wolfman, in addition to werewolf history, Siodmak drew on his own experience being a Jewish person fleeing Nazi Germany. His own feelings of persecution and the horrors of the Holocaust greatly fueled him during the writing of the film. The Wolfman is, in essence, a metaphor for his own flight from the Nazis. Siodmak once said, "I am the Wolfman. I was forced into a fate I didn't want, to be a Jew in Germany."
In summation, Siodmak took parts of his life, combined them with the lore of the werewolves, and ended up changing the entire mythos of the creature into what we know it to be today. Now that we know the mythology of the werewolf and where the specific inspiration for the original 1941 Wolfman movie came from, then let's talk about what this new one can offer over 80 years later. What sets it apart from its predecessor?
The director of the 2025 version of The Wolfman, Leigh Whannell, made his feature film debut in 2004 because of another horror film that you've probably heard of. Along with James Wan, Whannell created Saw. I talk about Saw at length in another video. If you're interested, then check that out after this one. Whannell also directed the 2020 version of The Invisible Man, another Universal Monster movie remake, which I really liked. It was a very different take, but still horrifying. If he does with The Wolfman what he did with The Invisible Man, then I'm very much on board. Leigh Whannell has said that he drew inspiration for the 2025 film from multiple sources, including David Cronenberg's The Fly. Whannell was inspired by the way The Fly used practical effects to illustrate the tragedy of the human body falling apart. He was also inspired by the isolation and confinement of the COVID-19 pandemic. He wrote the first draft of the script in 2020 during lockdown, and wanted that feeling to be present in the film. He took inspiration from several other werewolf films for the design of his Wolfman, including the original 1941 The Wolfman, An American Werewolf in London from 1981, The Howling from 1981, and Dog Soldiers from 2002. He was also inspired by Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker. To me, it sounds like Leigh Whannell is doing everything that he can to make his new version of the Wolfman the best that he possibly can. From practical effects to looking at his predecessors, having a great cast, and using personal experiences to fuel his ideas. As writers often say, write what you know. Combining all of this with 20 plus years of experience, the fact that he has written, directed, and been a part of several of my favorite horror movies, and that he just seems like a super nice and affable guy from Australia, I'm weirdly excited to see this new version of The Wolfman.
So let me know in the comments if you've seen the reboot by now, or if you plan on it. If you have, then what did you think? Was it better or worse than you thought? Have you seen any of the older Wolfman movies, or any of the other Universal Monster movies? And let me know what other horror movies or books you'd like to know the story behind their story.